The right loves when children are raped. I've said it a million times, but it's simply true, okay? The right has fought tooth and nail to preserve child marriage in this country, and on top of that, despite all of the overwhelming evidence that teaching children basic sex education allows them to have the knowledge they need to warn an adult, to alert an adult that they are being sexually abused if it should happen. Despite all of the data, all of the evidence, the overwhelming incontrovertible evidence, I should add, about all of that, the right continues to fight against these things while continuously claiming they are against children being raped, against them being abused or being trafficked, etc. They claim all of these things, and yet their actions and what they stand for factually would result in the exact opposite outcome, which leaves me to believe either conservatives are delusional or liars. It really does come down to that every time, doesn't it? Delusional or liars? Well, I suppose I'll let you guys come to your own conclusion on what Matt Walsh is, but you see, this is an older video we're going to be reacting to. It's from a year ago, but Matt Walsh has declared this year as his year against the left-wing indoctrination of children, particularly the supposed trans indoctrination of children, to make that very clear. Now, I've decided that it would be fitting to go back a year in his upload history to respond to this video that I saw a clip of on Twitter just the other day, because I couldn't help it. The video is by Matt Walsh, of course, and it is called C is for Consent. Matt Walsh reviews a woke children's book. So let's go ahead and watch.
Okay, so now we're going to look at another woke...
Whoa! Matt Walsh is Sonic, confirmed? Okay.
Children's book. This one, on the surface, I mean, literally reading the book by its cover, it seems maybe not as bad as some of the others that we've looked at, that we've reviewed, but you never know. So we just kind of, we're going to read this whole thing. It's pretty short, and I'll read the whole thing, and then I'll offer my review. So let's get into it. This is called C is for Consent. And this is...
fair warning, by the way, if you do not have a brain that looks like a mouse's brain, like all smooth and tiny, then you may find the editing of this video frustrating, to say the least.
It says ages, this is for ages 0 and plus. So if you have a 0-year-old child, they could read this and up from there. I mean, you know, it's a board book, it's short, so this is really for kids probably, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. All right.
Okay.
It says, it's time for a party with family and friends.
Cool.
And you see, of course, there we've got the interracial gay couple, we've got the interracial disabled couple, one member.
Holy shit, I didn't even notice. How, like, I'm not gonna lie, guys, when they flashed this on screen, not even for a second did my brain consider the race, the state, the ability, the sexuality, etc. of any of the people on screen. Like, he flashed this image on screen, and I just thought, okay, cool. And he is the one that has to point it out. I feel like that should be indicative of, because the right, of course, loves to claim the left is obsessed with race, the left is obsessed with sex, the left is obsessed with gender, the left is obsessed with sexuality, the left is obsessed with identity in general. And yet, I, a lefty content creator, saw this, didn't even fucking notice, and he's the one who had to point it out. And it should speak to, who's actually in what headspace.
And you see, of course, there we've got the interracial gay couple, we've got the interracial disabled couple, one member of the couple's disabled. You got to get all the representation there.
Of course, Matt Walsh is against interracial couples and the ability for disabled people to continue living.
And that's...
Which is ironic for Matt Walsh.
I don't see any furries. I don't see anyone who's apparently transsexual or even transgender or pansexual, so that's a problem, but we'll keep going. Grandma wants a hug, but Finn isn't in the mood. That's okay, says Dad. You don't have to give hugs if you don't want to.
Base.
Grandpa leans down to kiss Finn. Mom says, please ask for consent first. Grandpa asks, may I kiss you on the cheek? Finn replies, yes, you may. Auntie and Uncle...
Okay. We're we're gonna get into the weird part of this video very shortly, when Matt Walsh starts responding to it. But for any of you who feel as though perhaps this is an odd book, it is very normalized in our culture that family doesn't really need to have permission to invade your personal space, especially when it comes to showings of affection, such as hugs or kisses. You're expected to let your I don't know, like your distant aunt kiss you on the face at the Christmas party when you really don't want that to happen. But if you don't let that happen, then your parents will yell at you or something. Like we've all seen like the stereotype, right? Now I haven't had anything like this happen with me, but I mean it's not an unheard of thing, right? This is an issue of consent. In our society, it is extraordinarily acceptable for adults, guardians who have, authority over their children, to disregard not only the bodily autonomy and the basic, like, human respect of, anyone who is younger than them, who is like a child, and especially their own kids, but particularly when it comes to, like, things such as invading their boundaries, Like, how often have you received a hug or a kiss from your parent in public when you didn't want them to? Isn't that kind of weird? Like you're like when it's the first day of school and your mom like grabs on you to give you a kiss and you're like, "No, please stop." Like, isn't that kind of like creepy when you think about it? Like your own mom grabbing you and holding you as you squirm away against your will to invade your space and kiss you like on the cheek before, and it always leaves you like with a weird spine tingle because no one likes that feeling. Like that's more of an example that I can relate with, right? Just stuff like that. Totally acceptable in our society to just trample over the consent of your own children because you're their parents. They do what they're your slave. They're your kid. They do what you tell them to. If they don't, you hit them or you punish them and take away everything they enjoy and make them miserable until they act in line. That's how you parent. That is what parenting is, right? Like, that is basically how our society views parenting, right? Is there anybody here who disagrees with that? That is a pretty damn good summarization of how parenting in our modern society works. This book challenges that idea. This book challenges the idea that, oh, you're a kid? Oh, well, then you should just put up with being touched when you don't want to be. Frankly, I don't think you should be touching kids when they don't want to be touched. I don't think that just because a kid is a kid means that they don't have a right to say, I don't want you to touch me. Please don't touch me. And for that desire to be met. I don't care if you're family. I think that's a valid, question. Now, obviously, I'm not talking about like your kid is having a temper tantrum in the grocery store and you grab their arm and you're pulling them out of the store and they're like, "Oh, don't, you're grabbing me out." Obviously, that's another scenario. But like the examples that are being brought up in this book and the examples I brought up here are very different from that, okay? Respect people's boundaries, even if it's your own flesh and blood. They still deserve to have their boundaries respected. This is a very, very appropriate and respectable book being written to teach, age appropriately, to teach children about the basic concept of consent. And hey, guess what? Regardless of whether or not it's sexual, kids need to know about consent. Young kids need to know about consent. Kids need to learn that you can't just take what you want and do what you want without consideration of other people. You guys know that's like a thing that kids do, right? Like the patented brutal insult from a child, Like when an adult gets the most brutal insult they've ever heard from their life in a child because it's 100% unfiltered honesty, because children are generally not taught to keep their fucking mouths shut. Yet, they're kids. You got to teach them how to be properly respectful adults, and being a properly respectful adult involves respecting other people's consent and their boundaries. And when you don't respect the consent and boundaries of kids, then they're not likely to respect the consent and boundaries of other kids. And when they grow up, let's just say it stops being cute, because they're not kids anymore. Then they're full-grown adult men and women that aren't following people's consent, that aren't asking for consent, that aren't making sure they're getting consent first, that aren't following people's boundaries, etc. It's how you end up with a world full of Matt Walshes, is when those kids grow up.
Want Finn to sit with them. Come sit on my lap. No, you have to sit on my lap. Finn says, no, thank you. My parents say I don't have to sit on anyone's lap if I don't feel like it. What a brat this kid is.
Matt Walsh is 100% the creepy uncle at the Christmas party that none of the nephews and nieces want to... This is literally Matt Walsh arguing against the concept of a kid feeling creeped out by their creepy uncle. Oh, what a brat you are if your creepy uncle wants you to sit on his lap and you don't want to. Like, what the fuck? By the way, insight here into how conservatives actually feel about children's boundaries and consent.
Mom's friends give Finn a present. Does that mean he has to hug or kiss that person? Only if he wants to. Maybe Finn could high five or fist bump instead, or maybe he doesn't want to be touched at all. It's his choice what happens to his body.
Yes.
Finn is happy to see his best friend Rue. He asks, may I hold your hand? It is okay for you to say no. Rue replies, yes, you may hold my hand. Thank you for asking first. And that's it. That's the end of the whole story. Okay. Then there are discussion questions.
Let's see what Matt Walsh could possibly take issue with in that book. I want to make it clear, by the way, that book simply argued in favor, not even argued, simply taught the concept of consent. So if Matt Walsh takes issue with this book, then really the only way he could take issue with it is if he has a problem with consent conceptually speaking, particularly when it comes to kids.
Questions at the end, which we won't get into. Well, so that actually is, somewhat surprisingly, this is the worst one yet, I think. This somehow manages to be more disturbing than books that are pushing transgenderism and bisexuality and all that kind of stuff. Those books are bad too, but don't get me wrong, but this one disturbs me on a deeper level.
Well, yeah, because you want to be able to rape kids, and it would teach kids how best to avoid being sexually assaulted by conservatives. Yes. So of course you'd hate it.
So let's count the ways. To begin with, before we get to the major problems here, this kid is awful. I mean, this is what happens when you have permissive hippie parents. I wouldn't.
Is this kid real? This guy wrote, by the way, I should remind you, Matt Walsh wrote a children's book about a kid who decides he wants to be a walrus. He did the attack helicopter meme as a children's book that he sold, and it's about a little boy who decides one day that he wants to become a walrus. And I just couldn't help but think of the movie The Walrus, in which a mad scientist, Tusk, sorry, the movie's called Tusk. I couldn't help but think of the movie Tusk. Okay. So yes, very good movie, by the way. Tusk. If you haven't seen it, if you're feeling like not sleeping for a while because of some body horror, it's very much body horror, then you might enjoy Tusk. Anyway, so little boy decides he's a walrus, and then the rest of the book is literally just the attack helicopter meme made into a book. What the fuck else do you expect from the mind of Matt Walsh?
I can't imagine if I was a little kid, if I was like 6 years old, and my grandmother came to visit and said, hey, give me a hug. And I said, nah, I don't feel like it, Granny. I cannot imagine what my dad's reaction would have been. It would not have been pleasant, I can tell you. My reaction...
So, conservatives are in favor of child abuse, if that wasn't already obvious. I am glad that I can make the title of this video, Matt Walsh Likes Child Abuse, without getting sued. Because he literally includes a clip of a child getting smacked in response to what he thinks ought to be done in a situation where a child doesn't want to be touched. He thinks that if a child doesn't want to be touched, then they should be smacked. Physical retribution for not consenting to being touched by a family member is what Matt Walsh sees as a valid response.
With my own kids wouldn't be pleasant in that situation. Yes, I tell them. I guess let me tell you something. I violate my kids' consent all the time in the sense that I force them to do things they don't want to do.
Sit down
That's much of the day, in fact, is involves them doing things that it's not their idea to do those things. They don't really want to do those.
So basically what we're going to get here is a mix of advocacy for child abuse along with like small hints at like actual parenting. So like, guys, guess what? Hot take. Oh my God. Sometimes kids don't want to do what they're supposed to do. Sometimes kids want to eat a bunch of candy instead of the dinner that you just spent all night making. The healthy dinner you spent all night making. Sometimes that happens, and you have to be stern and enforce discipline and say, no, you can't always get what you want. Sometimes you have to get what you need. That's what my uncle would always say. You know what my uncle would always do to discipline me when I was younger? When like I wanted something and I couldn't have it, he'd just start singing, "You can't always get," and it'd get me so fucking mad. But after a year or so of that, it worked. It didn't take getting smacked in the face or getting screamed at or grounded or yelled at. Just having it pointed out how ridiculous it is to be so entitled. Even to a kid, if you have it pointed out to you enough, you'll start to realize, wait a second, this is cringy. I shouldn't be doing this. You don't need to beat submissiveness or beat behavior into your children. Trust me, there are other parenting methods that work better than, hitting them.
Those things. Clean their room. Let's start with that. Like, I don't get their consent for that. What is that, forced labor? Is that slavery? My kids know that when...
Well, no, it's not slavery to make your kids clean their room, but it's probably slavery if you're like one of those parents who posts on Facebook all the time about, I'm so glad I have kids to force to do all the house chores now, and then they just sit on their ass all day. Then yeah, that's basic. That's kind of slavery. Not gonna lie. That's a high tier investment into that's a high value biological investment. Thank you.
And a family member comes over to visit, you go and give them a hug. It's not an option. It's not a choice. You are.
By the way, this book does not have anything to do with chores or parenting, like responsibilities for a child or anything like that. This book was purely plain and simple about consent, about don't touch people who don't want to be touched. Don't go into the space of people, into the personal space of people that don't want to have their personal space impeded on. Respect other people's boundaries. Being a child does not mean that it is okay for your boundaries to be violated or, frankly, to violate the boundaries of others. Because the book teaches both sides of that. Both that you should be knowledgeable and wary and considerate of the boundaries and the consent of others, as well as to teach that people ought to be, and you should stand up for yourself if people are not, respectful of your boundaries and your consent. The book teaches both of those lessons. Both of those lessons Matt Walsh opposes, as does his entire audience and everyone who stands for his beliefs.
Are required to do that.
Well, don't look at me like I'm frickin' Frankenstein. Give your father a hug.
Because that's polite. But the major problem here is that the book explicitly sexualizes physical contact between family members. I mean, this all...
No, it does not. It simply doesn't. There is no reality in which that is what it does. This right here is a very good insight into the perverse mind of the conservative. Conservatives like to accuse lefties of being these extremely degenerate, disgusting, sexually perverted, dangerous to children, etc. Just go on the list of things you've probably been called by a conservative online at some point, and you understand what I'm talking about. Is it starting to become more and more clear where those accusations are coming from? They're very creative accusations, aren't they? Very detailed, creative accusations the right tends to lob at the left. Almost too elaborate to make up, right? The claims about the plans to groom children and to abuse children and whatnot. That doesn't it, and the plans for stealing elections and world domination. they all seem very, very nuanced and well constructed, these conspiracies, to be completely made up. It almost sounds like it's the right projecting all of their desires and beliefs onto the left. They believe if they're such horrible pieces of shit, the left must be too. Everyone on the left must be as awful as them. Their beliefs must be as awful as them. They must want to rape children as much as they do, but they just must be like, they must believe that, like, the left, because of course the right, they're all a bunch of pedophiles. They believe the left are also pedophiles just like them, but that their way of advocating for it is through, like, the trans stuff or something. Maybe that's what they believe. I genuinely can't tell. Maybe it really is all just projection and misdirection, trying to get society to stop paying attention to the Republican Party and the the church and all the defense that the right has done of child sexual abuse and exploitation over the years, to redirect it onto those that have always been fighting against it historically. Maybe that's what they're doing. I can't really tell, but what's very clear here is what Matt Walsh stands for. And what Matt Walsh stands for here is child abuse. And if you want to take it far enough, well, much worse than the broad umbrella of child abuse.
Author is who is it? Eleanor Morrison. He, his, her, whoever's. They're taking their own.
I like how he wanted to make it seem like a pedo wrote the book, so he said a he, and then the book was written by someone who's clearly a woman, because Eleanor is a pretty feminine name, and then he says he, she, whatever, because a very common right-wing tactic when trying to, so something the right will try to do very often is make an argument about how ridiculous the amount of pronouns you have to keep track of is now. They'll try to claim that keeping track of all these pronouns is so hard, so ridiculous. Oh my god, look how ridiculous it is, how much of an ask it is to keep track of all these pronouns. But they don't actually have any arguments, and it's a very obviously ridiculous argument. So their way of making that argument is to instead just performatively act confused about pronouns. Say he, she, it's, whatever, when it's very obvious and they clearly know what pronouns are correct. They just kind of pretend like they're confused about which pronouns they should use very, very performatively, instead of making an argument as to how these pronouns could be hard to remember for people. Because they can't. Because they failed English class if they actually have an issue keeping track of fucking pronouns.
I don't want to misgender them. Whoever it is, they're taking their own complex and projecting it onto everyone else. I don't know what's going on with you, that you view a hug from an aunt or a grandfather as potentially sexual in nature.
By the way, conservatives very, very much so rely on the idea that parents and family members cannot in any way abuse their own flesh and blood children. The master-slave dynamic of the average conservative household, where it's like the man is the master of the household, the mother or the wife is like the subservient, broodmare of the husband, and then the children are the lowest rung of the totem pole, basically representative of, honest, like, if you imagine the average conservative household as like a shrunken down scale of America, children are meant to represent minorities in that way, right? The group that you are allowed to keep down, the group that by definition, just because of who they are, children, you are allowed to talk down to them. You are allowed to treat them as lesser. That you are allowed to tell them what to do, and they have to do it. You can punish them if they don't. They are not allowed to fight back. They can't even do it. They can't even physically fight back because you have more power over them. They see their imposition of power over children as more of a concentrated, sort of shrunken down, more personal version of their more broader political desires they want to impose on all of society. The average conservative household, where the wife is the broodmare, the children are these subservient slaves that are constantly doing housework and chores all day, while the dad's on the couch drinking beer and watching the football game and being a lazy piece of shit, while the wife's cooking his dinner. That is the world that conservatives want us all to live in. They've achieved it in their own households and in their own family units, but they don't want to stop there. They don't want to stop at abusing their own children and their own wives and beating their own wives and molesting their own children and whatnot. They don't want to stop there. They want it to be the whole fucking world. At least all of America. They see children as property and as an extension of themselves, not as actual people / human beings with autonomy. Exactly. It's why conservative dads feel it as a personal insult if their son doesn't fight back against a bully. You guys seen that shit, right? The conservative dads who get mad at their sons if they don't fight back against a bully because they see it as like a mark on their masculinity, because they see their children as their property, an extension of themselves. That's more of a father issue, but you know, yeah, it's real. It's a real thing.
But it's something you should be talking to a therapist about. You don't write it into a children's book, for God's sake. And this is what you get from the left, right? They grew up on a diet of Freud, whether they know it or not. And
what? Isn't Freudian psychology what the right tends to stick to? For the record, Sigmund Freud's thought process about human psychology has long since been debunked and is not looked upon very positively by the vast majority of the psychologists and academics in the field of like the human brain, to be clear. So the only people I know of that continuously point to Sigmund Freud's beliefs as having any merit whatsoever in regards to human psychology are conservatives. I've not heard a lefty in a long time cite Freud as somebody who is worth listening to. On the left, Freud is a meme. Freud is like I'm not even like super into psychology or into ethics or into philosophy or any of that stuff. I think it's super gay and cringe, and for virgins. But even I know that Sigmund Freud is not exactly the Michael Phelps of human psychology. I'm sorry, I couldn't think of anybody who was like the top of their field at anything other than Michael Phelps. I was a swimmer, I'm sorry.
now they see everything in sexual terms. Everything is sexual. They're incapable of conceptualizing any human interaction that might occur outside of a sexual framework. Everything for them is sexual or potentially sexual.
This is nothing but projection. Consent is not inherently sexual. That is the thing that conservatives simply cannot see past here. That book does not bring up sex. That book only talks about boundaries and consent. Consent is not sexual, inherently speaking. Consent is... Hey, can I take a hit from your vape, bro? Yeah, bro, this shit hits hard. There you go. Ah, thanks, man. I really appreciate that. Here you go, man. Ah, no problem, dude. That was asking for consent. Was there anything sexual outside of that interaction whatsoever, other than vapes oftentimes looking a little bit phallic? Other than that, there was nothing sexual about that interaction. It was simply asking someone for another person's consent to use one of their personal items. Nothing sexual about it. What he's doing right now is muddying the water, trying to make it seem as though any discussion about consent that's attempted to be had with children must inherently be sexual, because conversations around sex around children are, understandably so, seen as odd and cringe and weird and perhaps even predatory. That is what Matt Walsh relies on. He relies on people turning their brains off, not thinking about how teaching children about consent could help prevent them from being sexually abused, and instead tries to get his audience to focus on the idea that consent is something they've only really ever heard in reference to sex, and trying to get them to believe that this is some lefty author trying to push sex on children, when it is just obviously not that.
And they're weirdos, in other words, to summarize.
Losers, in other words.
I mean, let's take the family dynamic out of it for a second, just for a moment, because I don't want to dwell on that. It's too disturbing. And let's pretend that we're talking about just some dude and a girl, and they're not related. Even in that context, the idea that verbal consent should precede every physical interaction is asinine.
Wait, so he's just full on coming out anti-consent. Just anti, like, yeah, okay, don't hug people or shake their hands unless they are okay with it. Also, I like how he specifies verbal consent there, as if, like, this person expects every single person to go out in public and be like, hey, is it okay if I shake your hand? Even when they're reaching out for an obvious handshake, you know? Or like when they go for a hug, to be like, hey, is it okay if I hug you before I like do the other half of this hug that you're going for? Like, what? No one's arguing for this. You're just trying to defend rapists. That's all he's trying. He's just trying to defend rapists and child molesters. That's all he's trying to do. Conservatives have to argue against the idea of consent. Not only this, actually, but if you want to get a better, I think we've heard enough from Matt Walsh in his defense of child rape. If you think this is just unique to the types like Matt Walsh, that is not in any way true. This is just a full-on, from the far right to even the moderate right, just a broad position. For the right to have their way, children, and particularly young girls, would have their autonomy taken from them in a conservative society. So, of course, there's Andrew Tate, who does his videos on how to rape women and everything, but there's also Nick Fuentes' Age of Consent. I really like this clip of Nick Fuentes talking about the age of consent because it really breaks down the more ideological side of it. This is Nick Fuentes going mask off and discussing how things like the age of consent, and whatnot, are anti-conservative and anti-right wing. He explains in this clip how conservatives should be anti-age of consent and should be anti-consent, etc., because it is definitively part of their ideology, whether they want to admit it or not. He just kind of said the quiet part out loud here, so let's listen to it. Let's hear it in his docet voices as I get banned from Twitch.
Hey, too, the whole age of consent thing is really a feminist social construct. I'll just put that out there. Because what are we really talking about here? Why are people so upset if somebody is 17 rather than 18? Well, that's because in the state of Florida, the age of consent is 18. It just so happens that the age of consent in Illinois is 17, and in other states, it's 16. And it varies from country to country and state to state. But if the age of consent is 18 in Florida, then it is the worst thing possible that you're, dating somebody that's a year younger, right?
Nick actually being honest. I'm going to be honest with you guys, chat. I don't think Nick Fuentes is a liar. I think Nick Fuentes has a, and I'm not saying this in an insulting way. I know people are going to try to clip it and say it's insulting. I'm being 100% honest and sincere here. And I'm not speaking with malice or any form of discrimination or negative connotation whatsoever towards any group here, or even Nick Fuentes himself. I personally believe Nick Fuentes probably has a developmental disorder of some kind, and he's probably emotionally and developmentally stunted. I think that plays a large part into his political beliefs. He's believed these Nazi things since he was a young teenager. He's been doing this stuff since he was like 16. He's now like a young adult of like 22 or 23 now. He's about my age. I'm sorry, but he's either got something. He's not neurotypical, is what I'm saying. And I'm not saying that as a way to insult him. I'm saying that I don't think he's this lying master manipulator demagogue like Matt Walsh. I think that he believes what he thinks and what he advocates for, and he's genuinely that deluded. I think he's extremely emotionally stunted from all the time that he spent in his early upbringing making right-wing content and just looking at a chat full of groypers spamming the N-word all day and making Nazi jokes, and I think he's probably got the mind of a 15-year-old. I think he's probably got the mind of a 15-year-old, realistically, unironically. That's my genuine armchair psychoanalytical view of Nick Fuentes. And this is not a meme or a joke or an insult or a bit. This is my genuine view of Nick Fuentes. And I point this out, and I know I'm going to get called ableist. It'll happen. That's just how things are online. But to be very clear, this is not a condemnation. It is important to acknowledge how certain people's being can affect the way that they interpret information or how they may engage online. And there are a lot of people out there online, and this is a real problem, who are not neurotypical, who are taken advantage of, and are pulled into these ideologies, and part of what pulls them in has to do with their disability. It is part of what pulls them into the right is something unique to their disability, or some desire, usually a desire to escape from it. There are a lot of guys in these spaces that have autism who are ashamed of it. And because of that, they oftentimes will bring out a large amount of their hate against other people online with autism. This is where terms like spurg came from. The word spurg is a ableist term used against people mostly online with autism, 100% invented by self-hating people with autism. It is a real problem online in these spaces. People with mental disabilities being taken advantage of and being at a higher risk of trying to find community in these spaces. And people on the left would call you ableist for pointing this out, but it's simply true. People with mental disabilities will try to find community online. They will try to find comfort and acceptance online. And the right will instead offer them hatred against others with a similar or the same disability. And they will fall to that instead of accepting who they are and loving themselves who they are. This is a simple fact, and if it offends you, then you're just wrong. It's a real problem. It really is. People with mental disabilities online are in some cases at a certain higher risk of being manipulated by these figures. And I think Nick Fuentes is one of these people. Nick Fuentes started making this content when he was 16 or 17, right? I don't believe he is an evil lying mastermind. I think Nick Fuentes is one of those people that got suckered into all of it, and he believes this shit. But that's just my view. Regardless, though, that was a little bit of an unnecessary stun lock, but I felt I'm glad I talked about it anyway. It's an important conversation. But my main reason why I showed that segment in conjunction with the Matt Walsh segment or clip, sorry, is because it's Nick Fuentes going mask off and saying exactly what Matt Walsh wants to say out loud. Conservatism requires that children, and I want to specify this, particularly young girls, have all autonomy, all agency, all ability to give or take away consent, and all ability to enforce their consent. So if you break my consent, then I can go to the police and have you arrested. They want those rights and those abilities taken away from women. And this is just one of the many, and children, this is just one of the many things that the right would do if they had complete and total control of our world. Anyway, if you somehow enjoyed this segment, please consider leaving a like and subscribing on YouTube. It helps my channel a lot. It's not just a simple hollow show of support. It actually makes my channel boost in the algorithm. Not to mention, Matt Walsh is known for sending his audience to just absolutely raid the fuck out of any left-wing channel that dares to speak out against him. So if you made it this far into the video and you actually want to make sure that my comment section isn't nothing but transphobic Matt Walsh fans dominating the conversation spamming ratio, then comment something down below. How about this? Matt Walsh abuses children. Simple as that. Just Matt Walsh abuses children. Or Matt Walsh wants to abuse children. Something like that. Type that down below. Maybe it'll drown out all of the Matt Walsh fans hate commenting, because let's just say as a 71,000 subscriber YouTuber, it's pretty hard to stand against a YouTuber with an audience of 1 million plus subscribers unless your audience is really standing by you. So if you guys come out into the comment section to battle these motherfuckers, then I'll see it happen and I will appreciate it. Of course, if you want to see more from me online, you can follow my social media, all linked down below in the description. You can follow my Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and join my fan Discord. And finally, if you want to support me financially so that I can continue pumping out this fantastic content for you guys to continue watching, then please consider donating, subscribing, or gifting someone else a sub on my website, xanderhall.com/live. It's always extremely, extremely appreciated. Without your financial support, I would not be able to do this for a living. Hell, I won't be able to afford to move to Seattle and start raising quail or pay my editor. So you guys really do just allow me to do this for a living. And if it weren't for you guys, then I would not have my dream job. So thank you to every single one of you for supporting me, no matter how you support me, whether it be for completely free, a simple view, or just a nice word in chat, or if you do go the extra mile and donate and give me money. I really do appreciate it. Thank you to every one of you, and have a good one.